Hello, my name is Stephen O'Reilly, and this is Roma Locuta Est Considers. Well, what is RomaLocutaEst.com? You may well ask yourself. Well, it's a wee humble blog that the world little notes, nor will it long remember, but it is devoted to apologetics and commentary on Catholic topics, current events, and general Christian apologetics. We do not seek, we do not accept donations. No funding is received from any source. We're beholden to no one, and we alone are responsible for the content. And this is episode 15 of Roma Locuta Est Considers. Here we continue with our discussion of Benepapism, and today we'll look at the question of Apostolic Blessings and some other disputed questions that are kind of related to that. Okay, in this episode, of course, the main topic we'll get to here is Apostolic Blessings, but first, before we get to that, we'll look at some of the other objections that Benepapists have with regard to Benedict's resignation. They claim that his use of Pope Emeritus in some way indicated that he intended to remain Pope in some way. Same thing for his use of a style of address such as His Holiness or Your Holiness. Why would he do that if he were not truly Pope? Then also they say, well, he wore white. Popes wear white, so he wore white, therefore he's a pope. Seems to be the style of argument that they make. And then, of course, as I said, we'll get to his use of apostolic blessings on at least a couple of occasions. Now, I'm not arguing that his use of any of these things was good or wise. Whether Benedict XVI handled the externals of his resignation wisely or not, maybe the subject for honest debate. Might it have been more prudent to return to being called Cardinal Ratzinger or Father Ratzinger? Was it prudent to keep wearing white and to continue living on Vatican grounds? Undoubtedly, seeing two men dressed in white within the Vatican, with one called Pope and the other Pope Emeritus, has been a cause for confusion for some Catholics, maybe even many Catholics. Perhaps in the future, should we have another Pope Emeritus, it might be best that he live out the remainder of his years in some remote monastery. There, access to him would be limited and even restricted, given the obvious potential for confusion and mischief. One can only hope that if Francis were to resign, that some future pope, or the pope immediately following him, would perhaps send Francis to his beloved peripheries to live as a Pope Emeritus, to live out his days that way. On the peripheries, as I said, perhaps in a hut in the Amazon jungle, with monthly supplies dropped by helicopter to him, and any contact with the outside world strictly forbidden. Okay, so here we'll look at first the title of Pope Emeritus, which the Benepapists claim indicates that Benedict somehow intended to keep or retain part of his munus or office, but I think if we look at canon law here, and the definition of emeritus, the Benepapist view is untenable. Canon 185 reads, the title of emeritus can be conferred upon the person who loses an office by reason of age or by resignation, which has been accepted. Now, first of all, granted, the context in the Code of Canon Law does not explicitly apply this canon to the Roman Pontiff. That's because here the canon is referring to someone who has lost an office due to a resignation which must be accepted. The Pope's resignation does not need to be accepted. Still, the text provides, by way of an analogy, an appropriate title which Benedict could have looked to for his own case. I mean, he was intimately involved with the drafting and the editing and so forth of the 1983 Code of Canon Law, from which Canon 185 does come. So in this regard, it is said that, as we look at the canon, it is said that the title of emeritus may be conferred on him who loses an office due to resignation. The significance of this fact is relevant to the argument over whether Benedict still believed he held his papal office. The answer to this must be no, as we look at this definition here, because emeritus connotes the reality of a loss of office. in other words, his papal office in the case of Benedict, owing to his resignation. So Benedict's adoption of the title Pope Emeritus means he recognizes he lost the office of Pope, meaning he realized, he's dead now, of course, he realized that he had lost the papal office by his resignation. So we saw in the prior slide regarding Canon 185 that the title Emeritus, or the honorific Emeritus, refers to an office which is lost by resignation. And if you combine that with Pope Emeritus, that certainly is a reference to Benedict being a former pope. He has lost the office, hence the use of Emeritus. So he's lost his office. So Benedict clearly viewed himself as a former pope without his office anymore. And thus he would have seen himself just like any other resigned pope throughout history who lost his office and was no longer pope. And we can see that is the case in his correspondence with Cardinal Brammuller. Cardinal Brammuller had, in I think it was 2017, was interviewed by a German paper or magazine. I won't dare pronounce it. I don't speak German, but the abbreviation for it is FAZ or FAZ. And in that interview, Brammuller had complained about Benedict's use of the title Pope Emeritus. And reading that kind of ticked off Benedict, that his old friend had done that. So he wrote a private letter to Brammuller, which was later leaked somehow by someone. And in his letter to Brammuller, Benedict said this in part. So again, this is Benedict speaking. In your recent interview with the FAZ, you say that I created, with the construction of Pope Emeritus, a figure that does not exist in the entirety of church history. Of course you know very well that popes have retired, even if very rarely. What were they afterwards? Pope Emeritus, or what instead? So we see here in that statement, what were they afterwards? Pope Emeritus, or what instead? So the implicit argument here that Benedict is making is that these former popes, these resigned popes in prior church history, were in fact, each of them were in fact a Pope Emeritus in fact, but not title, but not by title. They weren't known as that, but that's what they were in fact. They were former popes, so hence Pope Emeritus. Each one was a Pope Emeritus. So that's essentially the implied argument that Benedict is making here. What were they afterwards? Pope Emeritus, and that's what Benedict is pointing to, or what instead? So that's what they each were, in fact, but not name. So what? So Benedict's argument essentially here is saying that what those popes were, he is Pope Emeritus, in fact, or he was while he still lived. So Pope Emeritus just simply means former pope, and this is just kind of driven home in his correspondence with Cardinal Brammuller. Okay, and one final point here on the title of Pope Emeritus is it's clear in the Peter Seewald interviews with Benedict that Benedict did not see himself as bearing any authority any longer, whether it be with the munus or as holding the office of the papacy or the munus of the papacy. He believed he did not have that authority anymore, and that's clear from his interviews with Peter Seewald. And here, let's take a look at Peter Seewald, his interview with Benedict, entitled Benedict XVI, A Life, Volume 2, page 669. I think that's the Kindle version. And again, we'll see that it's clear from Benedict's answers to Seewald's questions that Benedict did not view himself as bearing any papal authority, bearing any papal munus in any size, shape, or form any longer since his resignation. And that's clear in his discussion about the title Pope Emeritus. So So here the questions are posed by Emeritus, by Peter Seawald, and the first one here is, what is an emeritus, bishop, or pope? And I won't read through all of this. I mean, you can put it on pause if you like and read the whole thing. I'll just kind of touch on, I think, some key points here. So here's Benedict's answer. Again, so the question is, what is an emeritus, bishop, or pope? Benedict responds, the word emeritus meant that he was no longer the active holder of the bishopric, but remained in a special relationship to its former bishop, as its former bishop. So again, here he's saying that emeritus means he's no longer the holder of the bishopric. He's no longer the bishop of that see. In Benedict's case, as pope, that would mean that he's no longer bishop of Rome. But he does want to make the case here that he's speaking here of having a special relationship still with his former see, his former responsibility. And that's key to remember. He's speaking of a relationship. He's of maintaining a relationship. He's not maintaining the munus. He's not maintaining the office. He's maintaining a relationship. And that's clear if you look at Benedict's last audience. I have a 2 or 3 part series on the last audience. I have a whole chapter in my book on the last audience. You don't have to go buy it. It'd be great if you do, but you don't have to. I have articles on, a lot of articles on the last audience on my blog, where I talk about and point out how Benedict in his last audience talks about the always and forever, and he defines the always as referring to a loss of privacy which impacted him upon becoming pope, and he defines what he means by a loss of privacy. That loss of privacy means that he now no longer belongs to himself, he belongs to others. He's now the father who has sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, and they belong to him, and they belong to him, and he belongs to them. So he's speaking of a bond of charity now that is formed once he becomes pope. This kind of special relationship with the church as people, not the church as an abstraction. So it's very touching, his explication of this in the last audience, and I recommend people read it because the Benepapists have butchered the darn thing, unfortunately. So he talks about this bond of charity that stems from his discussion of the always, but then he goes on to the forever. But he says this is forever, though. He cannot return to this life of privacy. He cannot walk away from the people, from this bond of charity that he has, that it persists. Even though he's resigning, this bond of charity persists, and that because of that, he will go on and devote his life in service of prayer to the church. And that's what he's talking about in the last audience, and this is kind of what he's referencing here too, about a relationship. And you'll see this throughout the rest of his discussion here on the Pope, on the use of the word emeritus. So going on here, again, I'm not reading the whole thing. You can put it on pause and read it all if you'd like. So I'm not trying to just skip over things other than just to kind of be a little quick on this. So the word emeritus said, so he's saying the definition, he puts it in quotes, scare quotes here. So the word emeritus said that he had totally given up his office. So again, he's saying his use of emeritus means he's totally given up his office. But then he continues, but his spiritual link to his former diocese was now properly recognized. So he's saying now, as we apply this, moving from being just a bishop of kind of a normal see versus being the pope of the entire church, his use of emeritus Pope Emeritus recognizes his relationship to the whole church. And again, he has a special relationship, as he points out in the last audience, to the whole church, and that's what he's trying to recognize with Pope Emeritus. Because that, as I said before, in the Declaratio, he talks about vacating the see of Peter, the need to elect a new pope, for a new conclave to elect a new pope, and then kind of like after that's all gone, and he's going to go on to his life after the papacy to live a life of prayer. He says that in the Declaratio, he says it in the last audience, and that's kind of what you'll be seeing that here in his answers to Sewall. So as he continues, again, he talks about a special relationship to the former see. Again, the use of the word relationship. So again, he's not speaking of munus, keeping a munus. What he's talking about is maintaining the relationship, is what he's talking about. This maintaining this bond of charity. Picking up here, it goes here. It does not affect the legal substance of the office of the bishop, but acknowledges the spiritual link as a reality. So he goes on to say here, so there are not two bishops, but a spiritual assignment. That spiritual assignment is living a life of prayer. So there's not two bishops of Rome, there's not two popes, but he is now recognizing that he has a spiritual assignment now to continue to pray for the church. And that's what, again, he said in Declaratio, that's what he said in the last audience. That's all he's referring to. He's not speaking of the maintenance of the papal munus within him in whole or in part. So here's what he says. But there are not two bishops, but a spiritual assignment whose essence is to serve his former diocese by being with it and for it in prayer with all his heart and with the Lord. Again, that's just what I've been talking about. So that goes on to the next question here from Sewald. But does this apply to the Pope? Benedict says it's hard to see why it would not apply to the Pope. And he goes on here to say here, in this formula, the Pope Emeritus, both things are implied. No actual legal authority any longer. So he's saying, I'm no longer Pope. I have no authority because I don't have the office. But a spiritual relationship which remains. It's a spiritual relationship, this bond of charity that remains. It's not a munus that remains, not an office that remains, because he said there's no authority remains. Only a spiritual relationship, his bond of charity towards the individual members of the church, sons and daughters. Even if it is invisible, this relationship, even if it's invisible. He continues, this legal spiritual formula avoids any idea of there being two popes at the same time. A bishopric can only have one incumbent. And again, look up the word incumbent, the definition of the word incumbent. I looked up just right before I did this. I should have probably put it on the screen. I think it was Merriam's Webster's dictionary. Look up the word incumbent. And an incumbent is an office holder. So he's saying right here, a bishopric, a see, can only have one incumbent, one office holder, one holder of the munus, one holder of the officium, only one. And then he's saying, by use of Pope Emeritus, he's saying that's not me. So he's clearly saying he's not the incumbent of the See of Rome. He's not the incumbent Pope. He doesn't hold the office. He continues. But the formula also expresses a spiritual link which cannot be taken away. And that's what he talked about. The always is also forever. Looking back now at the always from the last, his use of the word always in the last audience, the always is where he always refers to his loss of privacy when he becomes Pope. And by that he defines, it says he means he takes on this relationship, sons and daughters in the church, who are in an individualistic sense, not in some sort of abstraction. The church, he means like people. I have sons and daughters now, brothers and sisters. They belong to me. I belong to them. It's a relationship. This continues. This is the forever. This will continue even after he resigns. This love. He carries the love forever, not the munus forever. And that's, again, where the Benepapists have butchered Benedict's last audience horribly. It's a beautiful thing to read if you're not encumbered by the Benepapists' presuppositions. So anyway, I think enough said on that. So it's clear from all this that the Pope Emeritus to Benedict does not means he does not have authority. He's saying that right here. He's no longer the incumbent. There's no idea of there being two popes or any of this. So it's impossible to get there being two popes or kind of two popes or a pope and a half from this information or from either canon law that we looked at, the interview or the letter, Benedict's response to Bramuller's interview, or just looking at his interview here with Peter Seawald. I mean, it's pretty darn clear that that Benedict is speaking of himself as having lost the office, but he carries forward this spiritual love and affection, this bond of charity forward, and because of that, he's going to pray for the church as a former pope. Okay, we could probably handle this a little more quickly. Here we're talking about the use, the style of address for Benedict as Pope Emeritus, calling him Your Holiness or His Holiness when you're in his presence or referring to him. With regard to Your Holiness, this is an honorific title or usage. It is commonplace for someone who, the thing to remember though is that it's commonplace for someone who once held high office to be referred to by their former position. Commonplace to refer to former office holders by the title or forms of address. And here again, we're talking about His Holiness or Your Holiness that were used for their former office. And that's done just as a sign of respect. So, for example, former presidents are still referred to as Mr. President, whether they're still alive. So even someone like Obama or Clinton or Bush, they're being interviewed. The interviewer, just as a sign of respect to their former office, might refer to them as Mr. President. And something similar, with regard to generals or military titles such as general, colonel, or other political titles such as governor. A former governor might still be called governor, even though he's not a governor. The same thing with senator. So, in that respect, you can see how His Holiness could be used, kind of like the use of, well, certainly in the case of Emeritus, which refers back to the former title, Pope Emeritus. Emeritus means, or the honorific refers to a loss of office, so Pope Emeritus is referring to a pope who's lost the office, but we're calling him Pope Emeritus as a sign of respect, just like you might say Professor Emeritus. The professor is no longer a professor, but you refer to him what he formerly was as a sign of respect. And so, should he have used this or not? Would it have been better not to go with Your Holiness in retrospect? Possibly, maybe yes. But the hindsight is 2020, as they say. The key point here is calling him His Holiness, Your Holiness, has some precedent for other positions. Maybe in the future to avoid confusion for folks, maybe future former popes, should we have any more, who resign, should not use it, maybe use and not use some of the other things that Benedict did. But that's not the point of all this. Is that just that calling him Your Holiness or His Holiness is not in itself, does not mean that he still viewed himself as Pope or that others around him viewed him as Pope. Okay, so moving on, we've talked about the title, Pope Emeritus. We've talked about the usages of things such as His Holiness, Your Holiness. Now we get to other things such as various things that Benedict could wear, maybe as Pope, and then what he didn't wear as a Pope Emeritus. So, while the Benepapists make much that Benedict still wears white, they neglect the fact that Benedict did change his attire from the time when he was Pope to the time when he was a resigned Pope, a Pope Emeritus. we can see again looking at Seewald's book, Benedict XVI, The Life, Volume 2, Kindle version, page 652. I already highlighted it here. Here, this is Seewald talking, though, about some of Benedict's thought process as he was approaching the actual effective date of his resignation. He talks about how, as there was no precedent for a pope resigning, I think the last pope who resigned was like 700 years ago, 800 years ago, 700 years ago. So Benedict discussed with his colleagues whether his future title should be Papa Emerito, Pope Emeritus, and obviously it's clear that he went with that. But he never wrote a document where he kind of explained, never any kind of formal document saying this is what it means and all this. So it was, in a sense, it was still adopted in an informal way. And then as for the dress code, Benedict decided to keep the white cassock. But again, so the Benepapists always want to say, "Oh, he's dressing in white," as if to say he's popes wear white, he's wearing white, therefore he's pope or was pope. But that is faulty logic. First of all, yes, he did wear the color white, but Benedict did alter the style of his dress, and you never really hear any Benepapists talk about that. They just kind of just quickly move on. Oh, he's wearing white. He's the Pope. But he didn't. He did not. Benedict did wear white, but he never wore the mozzetta again. That's like this big cape thing that sometimes I think oftentimes most like in red you'll see the Pope, because red is like a color that popes used to wear a lot. In more ancient days, hundreds of years ago, before they went with the Dominican white as the standard papal attire. But Benedict would wear the mozzetta, which is a sign of authority, and he never wore that again once he became pope. He did not wear the cincture. That's what goes around the waist of the pope in the full papal cassock. And then he never wore the red shoes again. The red shoes they wore as pope were kind of a symbol of authority as well. So the mozzetta was a sign of authority, as were the red shoes, and all these things he dropped. All right, just no need to really belabor the point too much here, but like here's an example. Oops, wrong color. So you see a little arrow there pointing to that. That's Benedict wearing a mozzetta. Here it's the red mozzetta, and symbol of his authority. Never wore that again after he resigned. He used to wear it a lot before he resigned. Never again after he resigned. So he gave it up. Why? Because he gave up being the Pope. And then again, just the symbolism of it, just to back up what I was saying, the symbolism, the mozzetta is a sign of authority. So he gave it up because he's giving up his sign of authority, in his case, his authority as Pope. Okay, not to belabor a point. Then another thing that Benedict stopped wearing was it's called the Pellegrina. That's this kind of like cape. It's kind of like a mozzetta. I think it's called a Pellegrina or Pellegrine in Latin. Don't bet on my pronunciation, but I think it's a Pellegrina in Italian. So this little cape-like thing that goes around like basically his shoulders, that he stopped wearing. And again, here's the signal. But this is a picture of him when he was a pope, though. And then, of course, around his waist, this kind of belt-like thing here is the cincture, I believe it is called. And that, too, he stopped wearing after his resignation. And again, just a picture of the two together. We have Pope Francis, and we have Pope Emeritus Benedict. And you can see just in this picture, shows you the differences between the style of dress. So you have Francis, let's see here, Francis wearing the Pellegrino, which again is kind of like Mosetta. You notice that Benedict is not wearing that. You have Francis around his waist wearing the cincture, and it has like this long tassel-like thing that kind of hangs down the leg, and I think the bottom of which is the papal coat of arms. I think only a pope is allowed to do that, and Benedict didn't do that. He didn't wear the coat of arms like that. So again, that just shows side by side how Benedict just wore a simple cassock and did not wear those things which would normally adorn or be added to a cassock to make it the papal cassock or dress that he gave up when he resigned. Okay, and then finally, in terms of just other things that changed with Benedict, what he stopped wearing after he resigned. Again, you won't hear, I mean, you'll have, Benepapist would love to quote various parts of Swain's speech to find controversial things in there, but they kind of conveniently leave out things that don't fit in with their theory. And Swain, in his famous 2016 speech at the Greg, he says, I was present when Benedict XVI, at the end of his mandate, removed the fisherman's ring. Now, the fisherman's ring obviously is a sign of papal authority, and here you have Swain as an eyewitness to Benedict removing it. I mean, you'll see pictures with Benedict wearing a ring, but Swain says he took off the fisherman's ring. So and offhand, I don't know what he did afterwards. I don't know if he went back to wearing his old Episcopal ring or whether or not they took the fisherman's ring and defaced it. But the point is, he removed the fisherman's ring at his resignation as a sign of him of Benedict giving up the papacy. So I was present, again, Swain says, I was present when Benedict XVI, at the end of his mandate, at the end of his papacy, removed the fisherman's ring, as is customary after the death of a pope. Even though in this case he was still alive, of course, because he's a resigned pope. So again, Benedict took off the fisherman's ring, signifying that he was surrendering his authority and giving up his authority, giving up the chair of St. Peter. All right, so just to recap our discussion of things that popes wear and things that a Pope Emeritus does not wear or call himself. With Benedict, we saw that the honorific of Emeritus is used for an office that's lost, a loss of office that's lost by resignation. Thus, the title Pope Emeritus essentially means therefore former Pope. Emeritus refers to a lost office. Well, what office are we talking about? The papal office. So Pope Emeritus is just a nice, respectful way of saying former Pope, just like you might say Professor Emeritus refers to a former professor, but you're respecting him by still kind of referring to his former role, but recognizing that he's no longer that. Then we saw, from the quote from Seawald, where he talked about Benedict prior to his resignation, asking friends about, what should he call himself and so forth. So, and then Benedict talking about wearing only a simple white cassock. So Benedict was conscious prior to his resignation that he would change things around so he would not appear papal. Now, whether or not you say he succeeded, would it have been great maybe if he had stopped wearing white altogether. But the point is, though, he stopped wearing things that were highly symbolic of being the Pope, such as the mozzetta, the familiar pellegrina, that the white one that you'd wear with this kind of like white cassock, not wearing the cincture anymore, stopping or not wearing the red shoes anymore. So he went to wearing just a simple white cassock, and again, no mozzetta, no red shoes, no pellegrina, no cincture, and then again, as we just discussed, we have an eyewitness account from Gonswein that Benedict did remove, in fact, the fisherman's ring, which is one of the two items that a pope takes on when he's inaugurated, when he begins his papacy. When they have the inaugural mass for his papacy, one of the two items given to the pope is the fisherman's ring. So the removal of it by Benedict is highly significant and clearly shows that he recognized that he was giving up the papal office. All right, so this brings us to our last topic of discussion, and that is Apostolic Blessings. I have one of the objections I respond to in my book is the Benepapist objections regarding Apostolic Blessings. I also have an article on my blog on Apostolic Blessings, so you don't have to buy my book. You don't have to buy my book. You can get the article on my blog. And so here, the objection is that there were a couple of occasions. I think I'm aware of two. I think there was one, maybe two letters to Bramuller and one to Syrah, and there might be another one. There might be only, I think I'm aware of about maybe 3 or 4 instances of Benedict giving his apostolic giving an apostolic blessing in a letter. And here is one. I just excerpt this one right here on the screen. Again, this letter I'm quoting or excerpting from an article in National Catholic Register. This was by Edward Penton. The article was by Edward Penton, and he was discussing, again, that kind of that controversy that I referred to earlier when Bramuller was interviewed by a German paper, and that kind of, I think, kind of ticked off Benedict, that Bramuller was taking issue with the title Pope Emeritus, and then Benedict kind of sent him a charitable zinger, saying, "Hey, what's up with that?" But at the bottom of one of those letters, or I think there were 2 letters that Benedict wrote to him in their little back and forth, and at the bottom of one, and I'm just excerpting here because this is really only the key point of it here. Benedict ends his letter saying, "Let us pray instead, as you did at the end of your letter, that the Lord may come to the aid of his church." And then Benedict says, "With my apostolic blessing, I am yours, Benedict XVI." So obviously the key point of contention here is that Benedict is giving his apostolic blessing. He's saying, "My apostolic blessing." So the Benepapists would object, or do object, saying only popes have the authority to give an apostolic blessing. Whoa, wait a second. Here we have Benedict giving one, and therefore the Benepapists would kind of argue, or do argue, that therefore Benedict must still believe himself to be pope in at least some way, to think that he can give an apostolic blessing by using the possessive "my" when he imparts his apostolic blessing here, in this case to Cardinal Bramuller. So as the Benepapists would argue, therefore Benedict clearly indicates he believes himself to still be papal in some way. And then, of course, this, for the Benepapists, would indicate that this either demonstrates Benedict did not intend to resign the papacy at all, or that if he did, that he committed a substantial error, as the likes of Van Barnhart and Mark Doherty, Dr. Mazza, would argue, and that this, but of course a substantial error, they would argue, in that case would invalidate the renunciation. So anyway, so that's kind of like the claim that by giving apostolic blessings, Benedict is indicating in some way that he is still Pope. Either that he thinks himself Pope in some completely, or partially that he's still able to give apostolic blessings. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so the question is it true though to say that only the Pope can give apostolic blessings? I guess it's partly true, partly not true. Here is a quote from the ceremonial of the bishops on benedictions, of the part about apostolic blessings, and I translated this from the Italian. This comes from I think a relatively new book out there on a new entry into the debate on the validity of Benedict's resignation. Is called Non era più lui, una risposta al codice Ratzinger sulla rinuncia di Benedetto XVI. And in that book, in one of the footnotes where he discusses, in that book, the author discusses apostolic blessings. He provided this handy dandy quote, which I have kindly he has kindly provided in his book, and I have excerpted as just a matter of convenience. But here in the ceremonial, it says the bishop in his diocese has a faculty to impart. He has the faculty to impart the apostolic blessing. So it's not just the Pope, right? So a bishop in his diocese has a faculty to impart the blessing with attached plenary indulgence 3 times a year on solemn holidays of his choice. So that's a key part. It's his choice. So even if he only attends Mass, the other prelates, equal in right to diocesan bishops, even if they lack episcopal authority, episcopal dignity, can from the beginning of their pastoral service impart the blessing with the attached indulgence within their territory 3 times a year on solemn holidays of their choice. So just to lay the groundwork that the Pope has the authority and he can delegate authority to others, and it's established that diocesan bishops have the authority to give the blessings 3 times a year on their choice of time and place within the context of these rules and regulations. And to give a little history on apostolic blessings, we take a look at the entry for it on the New Advent site, which is the Catholic Encyclopedia. And here's the reference to it. Just if you're not aware of the New Advent site, which has the Catholic Encyclopedia from 1907, I think it is, but an article by Frederick Hallweg on Apostolic Blessings from 1907. Here we go. Boom. Give some history of it. So and a little more detail on it. So let's take a look at it. So Apostolic Blessings. The popes very often delegated to others the powers to give this blessing in answer to petitions from princes at the close of missions, and on such occasions the power was restricted by Clement XIII in 1762. It was restricted to patriarchs, primates, archbishops, and bishops who petitioned the Apostolic See for it. They can give apostolic blessings on Easter Sunday and some other feasts. So it's kind of like what it's all in the ceremonial, that there are 3 times a year to the, I guess, the normal diocesan bishop, on special solemn occasions or feasts. Prelates who have the use of the pontificalia and jurisdiction over a certain territory can give it only once a year. So there's some restricted use of it. In these cases, a certain formula is prescribed. So there's something you got to read through, and that I don't have it in front of me, but there's a formula for it. Superiors of certain religious orders, especially the Franciscans, can give it twice a year in the churches of their order. They must use a formula and ask permission of the ordinary to give it. So they have to get it delegated from the bishop to be able, their local bishop, to do it. The faculty is occasionally granted to particular priests. So particular priests can have the right to give it as well. It can be delegated, that delegated right to them. Regular or secular, to give apostolic blessings upon return from Rome at the close of missions or retreats. In this case, and this is key, no solemn rite is required. So we're seeing already that there are some cases that some sort of solemn rite or formula is necessary when giving it, and there are other cases where no solemn rite is required. The apostolic blessing is a sacramental, with which is granted a plenary indulgence, but no absolution under the usual conditions, but no absolution from ecclesiastical censures. During a jubilee, this blessing cannot be given. A special feature of this blessing is the apostolic benediction in articulo mortis. This blessing is given to those who are in danger of death by priests who possess the required faculty. So priests attending to those near death have the authority to give the blessing. A formula is prescribed by Benedict XIV. To gain the indulgence, it is necessary to receive the sacraments, to invoke the name of Jesus, and be resigned to the will of God. And it goes on. So again, the key points here is that historically it was given the right or faculty to give the apostolic blessing was delegated kind of to lots of different varieties of bishops or prelates and priests at various points. In some cases, there's a specific formula that must be said. Other times, there's no formula that must be said. Okay, so the question is, by what authority did Benedict give the apostolic blessings on those occasions when he did, in those private letters that we're aware of? It may be the case that Pope Francis delegated the right to Benedict, either with or without certain conditions attached to that right. As we know, per Canon 1161, subsection 1, it says the Apostolic See alone can establish new sacramentals, authentically interpret those already received, or abolish or change any of them. So Francis certainly had the authority to grant to Benedict, Pope Emeritus, the right to give apostolic blessings. And just a note here that shout out to Father John Rickert. When I was writing my book, I had already drafted a section on apostolic blessings, and he pointed out some of these canons to me, which I then incorporated into my reply to the objection in my book, and then also in my article on the subject on my blog. So shout out to Father John Rickert, who has written a lot of good things on the Benepapist question. So going back to that, so we see here in Canon 1167, subsection 1, the Apostolic See alone can establish new sacramentals, authentically interpret them, interpret those already received, or abolish or change any of them. So Francis, as Pope, could have granted to Benedict the right to give apostolic blessings, that he might do those. And he would not need to insert that into the various ceremonials or anything like that. It could, popes don't have to issue some public decree to do that. They can, they make cardinals in private. They can consecrate bishops in private for special reasons all their own. That Francis might have done this in Benedict's case is not should not be a surprise. Bishops are accorded the right to give a certain number of apostolic blessings each year. It certainly would be fitting that a former pope should be granted this privilege to an even greater extent in view of the dignity of his former office. But aside from Francis being one way in which Benedict could have received that delegation, it's not. I guess it's certainly possible that Benedict could have delegated it to himself. It may be that Benedict, while he was still Pope, granted, by his authority as Pope, granted to any future Pope Emeritus, without even having to, he doesn't have to write it down, he could grant to any future Pope Emeritus the delegated authority to give apostolic blessings. Obviously, this would apply to himself when he renounced the papacy. Again, Pope Benedict XVI could do this as granted by Canon 1167, which I've already read. So anyway, he could have received it from the authority to do it from Francis, and maybe as that's probably the way it happened. Though I would not rule out the possibility that he could have delegated it to himself, kind of saying, I hereby say that any future Pope Emeritus can give apostolic blessings under these conditions. So that's certainly possible, though I think the Francis route is probably the way it happened. And again, he would not need to issue a public declaration to that effect if that's what he did do. Okay, so the Benepapists will still ask at this point is, yes, but what about Benedict using the possessive my when imparting the apostolic blessing? For example, when he says, with my apostolic blessing, the Benepapists might object that by asserting it's his apostolic blessing that he is indicating that he has somehow the inherent authority to give an apostolic blessing, and therefore believed he was still fully Pope at the time, or at least Pope in some partial way. I think the answer to that is clearly no. If we look at Canon 1168, which states, the minister of sacramentals is a cleric who has been provided with the requisite authority. So Benedict, even as Pope Emeritus, after having been delegated, whether by Francis or by himself, as we talked about on the previous slide, he would be, or is, or was, the minister of the sacramental on the basis of having been provided the requisite authority per Canon 1168 via delegation. Consequently, even in giving the apostolic blessing in an informal setting of a private letter, he is the true minister of the sacramental. And we've already seen, as we saw in the New Advent article, that there are occasions where no specific formula is required. Thus, Benedict's use of the possessive my refers to the apostolic, certainly could refer to the apostolic blessing being his to give. I mean, he is the minister. He has the authority to give it when he chooses to give it. It's his faculty that he has to give it, that he's received to give it, to whom he chooses to give it. On those occasions, he chooses to do so as the true minister of the sacramental, for which he has been provided the requisite authority. So I think one can certainly see here that in using my in this delegated sense of being a true minister of the sacramental, and not in an intrinsic, inherent sense, meaning he's not pope, that this would apply only in the case, which would apply only in the case of a pope. As a final point, to my knowledge, Benedict has never gave the apostolic blessing in a public setting. I mean, it always seemed to be that I'm aware of in private, in private letters. Now, whether or not he did it with a small group of people in him, he never got out in public in front of 1,000 people and kind of blessed them and gave them an apostolic blessing, anything like that. So he was using it in a restricted sense. So he's only done it in private letters, maybe in private meetings. I'm not aware of that, but I wouldn't rule it out. But it's been done with friends and other associates or people who he's conducting some sort of correspondence with. So the lack of a precise formula for the blessing is not surprising. And but again, I don't see the my as being that. It's not surprising. Like I said, it's informal. It's his to give. He's speaking with friends or people he's corresponding with. And even when you ask a priest will say, "Let me, bow down, and I'll give you my blessing." But of course, he says, "May Almighty God bless you." So he's referring to God. So I mean, ultimately, God, the blessings ultimately descend from God. That does not prevent the priest from saying, "Let me give you my blessing," or "Father, can you give us your blessing?" when ultimately the blessing descends from God. So I don't see that the Benepapist objection here carries any significant weight. Okay, just kind of briefly recap on apostolic blessings. We've seen that Benedict, as Pope Emeritus, may have received the authority to give them from Francis directly. That certainly would be appropriate. I mean, bishops and patriarchs can give them on a certain number of occasions, even priests can, and other prelates in various ways, heads of religious orders. I forget all the examples I read off from the Catholic Encyclopedia earlier, but there's all these categories of prelates that can do it. But if they can do it in a limited fashion, how much more appropriate would it be that a Pope Emeritus, as in view of the dignity of his former office, might be granted even a greater extent to give them, or that they could have come from Francis. But I said I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Benedict could have delegated it to himself. But in either case, it was used only in private settings that I'm aware of. People the Benepapists keep on circulating I think the same few examples that are out there. I think I've only seen, as I said, maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 letters where he says it. There could be more. But again, it still doesn't change the fact that they're private letters that he's saying them in. So there's private correspondence. Did he give them in private settings? Some of those Germans came with their beers. Did he give them an apostolic blessing before they drank a stein of beer? Possibly. I wouldn't rule it out that he gave out apostolic blessings in small settings. Possibly. I'm not aware of any. No Benepapist has brought any to light, to my knowledge. But the key point, though, is it's all private. He hasn't gone out in public in some big public setting to thousands of people giving an apostolic blessing to them. So it's been very restricted, very private, very informal, very informally done. There's no specific formula necessary in some cases for apostolic blessings. So he was the true minister. He had the delegated authority, so he was the true minister of it. It was his decision. He had the authority. once it was delegated to him to decide when to give it, who to give it to, and all those things, all those particulars. So he was the true minister of it. So certainly in that sense, you could say it is his to give as a true minister, because he could decide not to give it. So in that sense, in that way, it is kind of his to give. So he could say my apostolic blessing. So I don't see that being a real issue. But the main thing is that there are more mundane explanations available to account for Benedict having the authority to give apostolic blessings, even as a Pope Emeritus, his use of my, and so like I said, there's more mundane explanations available to account for it, other than to wildly assert that Benedict must still believe, or must have believed himself to still be Pope in some way. And the last point I'd leave you with is that the Benepapists would have to show if they want to discard all these possible explanations that I've presented. The real point is that they would have to show, the Benepapists would have to show that the canons were violated here. The burden is on the Benepapists to demonstrate that there is no other solution other than their own. This they have failed to do. So in summary, if Benedict still gave apostolic blessings, that is not a proof that he believed himself to be Pope in full or Pope in part. And so on that, I shall conclude the discussion on apostolic blessings. Okay, we are nearing the end, but as I have done, I think, for all my other videos, I have just listed at the end here some resources, other resources on Benepapism, or arguments against Benepapism. So you can freeze this frame here if you're interested in finding other sources. But real quick, there's my book, Valid: The Resignation of Benedict XVI. It's available on Amazon and other fine booksellers. And there's a host of articles out there. There's a bunch of articles on my blog, Roma Locuta S, so you can go there. So those are all free things. So you don't have to buy my book. It'd be great if you do, but you don't have to. There's a lot of free stuff on my blog. But you could also find a lot of these videos. This is, like I said, this is episode 15. So there's another 14 episodes out there on various topics related to Benepapism. Others who've written fine articles out there include Ryan Grant, Father John Rickert, who I mentioned earlier in this particular video, Dr. Edward Fieser, and John Salsa has written a bunch of articles that have touched on topics of Benepapism as well. All right, we've reached the end. If you made it this far, thank you. God bless you for hanging in there with me. If you liked the video, please hit the like button and subscribe. If you didn't like the video and don't like me, don't subscribe. And don't hit the down button, though. But no, go ahead. Hit whatever button you want to hit. So in terms of next videos, I am not sure yet. So I'm contemplating what that topic might be. If you have a topic of interest, maybe a question that you think I haven't answered or you'd like to see more of, or something different, feel free to email me. My contact information is available on my blog, romalocutaest.com. So I do have a couple ideas on what I might go with. A couple months ago, Dr. Mazza attacked me with an ad hominem attack during a debate he had with Matt Gaspers. I did respond to that in an article, but I'm thinking of possibly doing a video on it as well. I haven't decided. I may. Or another topic might be critiquing Dr. Maz's article against universal adhesion or universal acceptance. So that might possibly be the next topic. I'm not sure yet. So stay tuned and find out. So anyway, thank you all again for watching. I point you to my books. I am writing a historical trilogy. Book one is called Pia Fidelis, The Two Kingdoms. It's set in the 4th century AD, Roman Empire. It kind of follows a host of characters, but kind of like the main backdrop is the rise of Julian the Apostate. Many folks have kind of compared our times to the times of the Arian crisis in which the book is set as being similar to our own times. So if you want to see how things turn out, you might want to start reading Pia Fidelis. Book two I'm working on, and I hope to get that out. Hopefully within the year. And then my book Valid, which is a book which addresses the arguments of the Benepapists and answers them in kind of an objection reply format. So I hope you would find that convenient to look at. So anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you again for watching, and take care.